Uh, I know exactly what you're thinking. A man my age, 63 years old, standing in a parking lot at 2 in the morning with a garbage bag of clothes and nowhere to go. You're thinking he must have done something wrong, made bad choices, burned bridges, deserved it somehow. Maybe. Or maybe life just has a way of waiting until you're tired before it hits you the hardest. My name is Gerald. I spent 31 years building a commercial printing business in Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous work. Not the kind of thing that gets you on magazine covers or invited to charity galas. But it was mine. Every machine on that floor, every contract in that filing cabinet, every employee who showed up on Monday morning, I had built that from nothing. From a single second-hand press in a rented garage when I was 32 years old, still grieving my father and terrified I had made the worst decision of my life. By the time I was 60, we had 47 employees, 3 facilities, and contracts with some of the largest logistics companies in the Midwest. I had put my son through college. I had paid off the house my wife and I bought the year we got married. I had done everything a man is supposed to do. My wife, Carol, passed away 4 years before all of this happened. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 11 weeks from diagnosis. I don't talk about that part much because there are no words that do it justice. What I will say is that after she died, the business became the only thing that kept me standing upright. Some men grieve with silence. I grieved with work. So when the business collapsed, it didn't just take my income. It took the last thing holding me together. It happened faster than I thought possible. A major client, one that represented nearly 40% of our revenue, was acquired by a national firm that had its own printing division. They gave us 90 days notice, which sounds generous, until you realize that 40% of your revenue disappearing means you can no longer service the debt on your equipment, your leases, or your payroll. I spent 8 months trying to restructure. I sold equipment. I let people go. And that hurt worse than anything else, looking those men and women in the eye and telling them I was sorry. I negotiated with creditors. I did everything right. It wasn't enough. The bank foreclosed on my primary facility in February. By April, the house was gone too. I had signed a personal guarantee years earlier, the kind of thing you do when you're confident and growing and you don't imagine the day when it will be called in. I had 30 days to vacate a house I had lived in for 26 years. I packed what I could into my truck. I put everything else in a storage unit I wasn't sure I could afford for more than 2 months. And then, I did what a father does when he has nowhere else to turn. I drove to my son's house. My son Daniel is 34. He lives in a nice neighborhood in Dublin, a suburb just northwest of Columbus. He married a woman named Kristen 6 years ago. I had helped them with the down payment on that house. Not a loan, a gift. Because that's what fathers do when they can. I want to be fair to Daniel. I think he was genuinely uncomfortable that night. I think he was caught between his wife and his father and he didn't know how to hold both things at the same time. I'm not saying he's a bad person. What I'm saying is that when I stood on his front porch with a garbage bag over my shoulder and told him I had nowhere to go, he looked at me for a long moment and then said he needed to talk to Kristen first. He was gone for 11 minutes. I know because I counted. When he came back, he didn't open the door all the way. He stood in the gap and he told me that Kristen wasn't comfortable with the arrangement, that they had a system, that having someone staying with them long-term would disrupt things. I told him I wasn't asking for long-term. I was asking for a few days while I figured out my next step. He said he understood that, but the timing wasn't great. I stood there on that porch in the April cold, and I looked at my son. This person I had coached in Little League for 6 years. This person I had sat with in the hospital waiting room when he had his appendix out at 15. This person whose college tuition I had paid and whose down payment I had given. And I didn't say anything. I just nodded. And I walked back to my truck. I drove to a parking lot outside a 24-hour diner about 2 miles from his house. I reclined in my seat as far as it would go. I was 63 years old, and I slept in my truck. I want to tell you that I was angry. Anger would have been easier. What I actually felt was something quieter and much heavier than anger. Like the last light going out in a house. Like finally understanding that some doors close and don't reopen, and you just have to accept where you are standing. I didn't sleep much. Around 6 in the morning, I went into the diner and ordered coffee and eggs I could barely afford, and sat by the window watching the parking lot fill up with people who had places to be. My phone rang at 8:17. The number was local, but I didn't recognize it. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. The man on the other end had a measured, unhurried voice, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has never needed to rush because rooms tend to wait for him. He introduced himself as Thomas Birch, and he said he was calling on behalf of his employer, a man named Warren Ellison. I didn't recognize the name at first. Thomas Birch gave me a moment, and then he said, quietly, that Mr. Ellison had requested to speak with me before the end of the week. That Mr. Ellison had requested to speak with me before the end of the week. That Mr. Ellison was aware of my current situation. That he had been following my career for some time, and that there was a matter he wished to discuss before he was no longer in a position to discuss anything. I asked what that meant. Thomas Birch said, with the same unhurried calm, that Mr. Ellison had perhaps 3 weeks left, possibly 4, and that he was very particular about how he spent what remained of his time. I sat in that diner booth for a long moment after I hung up the phone. My coffee had gone cold. The eggs were untouched. Outside, a woman was buckling a child into a car seat with the focused patience of someone who had done it 10,000 times. I thought about saying no. I almost did. I drove to the address Thomas Birch had texted me. It was a property about 40 minutes outside Columbus, in a stretch of countryside where the land rolls gently and the trees are old enough that their roots have broken through the road in places. The kind of land that belonged to someone before maps were accurate. The house at the end of the driveway was not what I expected. It wasn't a mansion in the way people picture when they hear the word. It was large, yes, but it had the look of a place that had been lived in. Genuinely worn stone steps, ivy on the east wall, a porch where someone had actually sat and spent time. It looked like a home, not a statement. Thomas Birch met me at the door. He was a compact, precise man in his 50s who shook my hand with the quiet efficiency of someone who had greeted 1,000 visitors and remembered every one of them. He led me through a hallway lined with framed photographs, not portraits but candid images, people laughing, fields, a fishing trip somewhere cold and northern, a man and a woman standing on a dock, not posing, just standing close. Warren Ellison was in a chair by a window in a room at the back of the house. He was smaller than I expected. Illness does that. It reduces people in the physical sense while somehow concentrating what is essential about them. He had white hair and hands that had clearly worked at some point in his life. Hands that didn't match the house or the paintings on the walls. He gestured to the chair across from him without getting up. And when I sat down, he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. He said he knew who I was. Not just my name, my history. He had known about my business since I was operating out of that garage. He had followed what I built, he said, the way he sometimes followed people who built things honestly in an age when honest building had gone unfashionable. I asked him why. He smiled at that. It was a small smile, the kind that carries something rueful in it. He told me he wanted to explain something, that it would be uncomfortable to hear and that he would understand if I got up and left before he finished, but that if I stayed, he hoped I would hear him out completely before I responded. I said I would. What Warren Ellison told me over the next hour was this. 11 years ago, he had been part of a private group. 7 men, all of significant wealth, all connected through decades of business and a shared philosophy that had, over time, curdled into something none of them had originally intended. The group had begun as a kind of informal investment circle. Men who trusted each other's judgment, pooled information, and occasionally backed ventures together. That was the original purpose. But over time, as wealth accumulated and insulation from ordinary consequence deepened, the group had developed what Warren called a practice. It was framed in the beginning as a study, an examination of character under pressure. The idea was that you could not truly know what a person was made of until you had seen them lose everything, and so the group would occasionally, carefully, quietly, using the vast machinery of interconnected influence that men like them possessed, arrange for someone to lose everything. Not randomly. They had criteria. They chose people they considered interesting. People who had built something real. People they were, in a twisted sense, curious about. They had done this to 4 people before the practice ended. One of those people had taken his own life. Warren told me this part without breaking eye contact, and I understood that he had practiced saying it, had said it to himself in the dark many times, and that it still cost him something to say it out loud to another person. I sat very still. He told me that the group had disbanded after that death, that the man who died had been a contractor in Dayton, a father of 3, and that his death had functioned like a bucket of cold water over a fire that had been burning for too long. They had scattered. Some had told themselves it wasn't their fault. Some had done what wealthy men often do when confronted with their worst acts. They had written checks to charities and called it even. Warren said he had not been able to do that. He said the weight of it had grown heavier as his health declined, that he had spent the last several years trying to determine what, if anything, he could do that would mean something, that would constitute something more than a gesture. He looked at me and told me that I had been on a list. Not the active list. The group had dissolved before I was ever targeted. But my name had been raised. Someone had found me interesting. And Warren, reviewing old files after his diagnosis, had come across my name and had begun following what happened to my business when the client was acquired. He had done nothing to cause it, he was clear about that, but he had watched it happen, and he had not intervened, which he said was its own kind of failure. He asked me what I thought. I told him I needed a minute. I got up and walked to the window and looked out at a field where 2 horses were standing in the pale morning light, not doing much of anything, the way horses do. I thought about the man in Dayton. I thought about his 3 children. I thought about the parking lot outside the diner and my reclined truck seat and the 11 minutes Daniel had spent consulting his wife before telling his father the timing wasn't great. I turned around. I told Warren that I appreciated him telling me the truth, that it was not a small thing to tell someone the truth about your worst acts when you don't have to. I told him that the man in Dayton deserved more than any of us could give him now, and that I hoped Warren understood that clearly, not as an abstraction, but as something he would carry specifically and without relief. He said he did. I asked him what he wanted from me. He told me he had restructured a significant portion of his estate before his diagnosis, that he had established a foundation, not a charity in the loose sense, but an operational foundation with a specific mandate. The mandate was financial recovery assistance for small business owners who had experienced catastrophic loss through no fault of their own. Practical help, not handouts. Structured support, mentorship, bridge financing, legal assistance, the kind of help that changes outcomes rather than just softens them. He told me he had been looking for someone to run it. He told me the salary, and I made sure my face didn't move. He told me he had chosen me not because he felt he owed me, though he did, but because he had spent 11 years watching how I operated, and he believed I understood from the inside what the people this foundation was meant to serve actually needed. I asked him what happened if I said no. He said he would find someone else, that the foundation would exist regardless, that this was not a transaction. He wasn't purchasing my forgiveness or my participation. He was making an offer that I was entirely free to decline. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about something Carol used to say. She had a saying she had borrowed from her grandmother, something about how the measure of a person wasn't what they did when things were easy, but what they chose to reach for when things were hard. She applied it to everything, the way she had handled her diagnosis, the way she had said goodbye. I thought about it now, about what it meant to be offered something real and either take it with open hands or let pride close your fists. I told Warren I would take the position. He nodded slowly, like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. Thomas Birch brought in coffee that was considerably better than the diner's, and the 3 of us spent the next 2 hours going through the structure of the foundation, the existing staff, the first cohort of applicants already waiting for review. It was real work, the kind I understood, operational problems, resource allocation, people who needed practical help more than sympathy. By the time I drove back toward Columbus that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. I felt useful. Warren Ellison passed away 19 days later. I was at the foundation office, a suite of rooms in a converted building in downtown Columbus, when Thomas called to tell me. I sat at my desk for a while after that. I thought about imperfect men and the choices they make when time runs out. I thought about how the worst thing a person has done is not always the complete definition of who they are, and how the best thing a person can do is tell the truth about it and try to build something worth leaving behind. 3 months after I started at the foundation, Daniel called me. He had heard, through some mutual connection, that I was leading a well-funded organization with a real profile in the business community. His voice was warm in a way it hadn't been when I was standing on his porch with a garbage bag over my shoulder. He said he'd been thinking about me. Said Kristen felt terrible about how things had gone that night and wanted me to know that. Said he thought maybe we could have dinner, catch up, talk about things. I listened to all of it. I told him I was glad he called, that I thought about that night on his porch sometimes, not with bitterness, but as a kind of clarity. The kind of moment that shows you something true that you needed to know. I told him I needed more time before I was ready to sit across a dinner table from him, that I hoped he could understand that. He said he understood. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment in my office on the fourth floor of a building I had no expectation of ever working in. Outside the window, Columbus was going about its Tuesday the way cities do. Unhurried, indifferent, full of people building things and losing things and deciding what kind of men and women they are going to be about it. I had a meeting in 20 minutes with a woman from Akron who had lost her bakery to a supplier fraud scheme and was trying to figure out what came next. I looked over her file one more time. She had built the business herself. Started with a single storefront. 11 years. She had done everything right. I knew exactly what she needed to hear.